Her children were planning to steal her fortune, but they had no idea what she would do. Norma sat by the bay window of her modest but well-kept home, sipping tea from a delicate porcelain cup. The sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the hardwood floors. Her faithful companion, Roberta, a sprightly little terrier, rested on her lap, her warm body providing a rare source of comfort. The silence of the house, once a haven, now felt heavy. It had been months since her children last visited. Norma was no stranger to solitude. After losing her husband, Jack, to a sudden heart attack in her mid-40s, she had poured her grief into building a catering business from the ground up. The long hours, the sacrifices, the tears, it had all been for her children. William, her eldest, a sharp but distant corporate lawyer, and Sarah, her youngest, a charismatic real estate agent. Both had once clung to her skirts as children, but now seemed strangers, wrapped in expensive suits and busy lives. Her thoughts were interrupted by the ringing doorbell. Norma's heart quickened as she set Roberta down and walked to the door. It was rare to have visitors these days. When she opened it, she was greeted by William and Sarah, each holding bouquets of flowers and wearing the kind of broad smiles reserved for holiday cards. "Mom!" Sarah exclaimed, pulling Norma into a tight hug. "We missed you!" Norma's chest tightened, a mix of joy and suspicion. It wasn't like them to drop by unannounced, let alone together. Still, she welcomed them in, her heart craving connection. Roberta wagged her tail energetically, circling the siblings. They sat in the living room, exchanging pleasantries over tea. William leaned back in his chair, the lawyer in him unable to relax entirely, while Sarah's laughter filled the room, almost too bright. It felt rehearsed, as though the warmth they offered came with a catch. "Mom," William began, his tone carefully measured, "Sarah and I were talking about the future. We're just worried about you here all alone. You've worked so hard your whole life and you deserve to relax," Sarah chimed in. "We were thinking it might be a good idea to consolidate some of the family assets, streamline things a bit, just to make things easier for you and, the family." Norma's brow furrowed. "Consolidate? What are you talking about?" Sarah leaned forward, placing a perfectly manicured hand over Norma's. "Just a few documents, Mom. It's really nothing. William's already taken care of the legalese. It's just a matter of signing. It'll secure everything for the family." Roberta, as if sensing Norma's unease, hopped onto her lap, her small head resting protectively on her arm. Norma smiled faintly, stroking the dog's fur as she studied her children. Their faces, though familiar, carried an unfamiliar edge, a coldness behind their smiles, but she dismissed the thought as paranoia. After all, these were her children, her flesh and blood. They loved her, didn't they? Reluctantly, Norma signed the papers they presented, her hand trembling slightly as she did so. The ink felt heavier than it should, and when the pen finally left the page, an uneasy silence settled over the room. The siblings stayed for dinner, their conversation light and peppered with compliments about Norma's cooking. They even offered to take her out for a drive in a few weeks, a rare gesture she cherished. When they finally left, Norma stood by the window, watching their expensive car disappear down the street. Roberta barked softly, as if to break the spell of silence. That night, as she prepared for bed, Norma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her children's visit had felt both a blessing and a riddle. What was it William had said? "Streamline things for the family." The words echoed in her mind, stirring a quiet storm of doubt. In the darkness of her bedroom, with Roberta curled at her feet, Norma stared at the ceiling. She thought of Jack and how he had once told her to trust her instincts. "They're there for a reason," he'd said. And though she wanted to believe her children had come out of love, a small voice in her heart whispered otherwise. Norma closed her eyes, gripping Roberta's collar for reassurance. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would take a closer look at the documents. The legacy she had built with her sweat and tears might very well depend on it. Norma spent the following morning poring over the documents her children had left behind. Sitting at the kitchen table, her reading glasses perched on her nose, she scanned the dense legal jargon, though much of it was incomprehensible to her. The language seemed purposefully convoluted, each line raising more questions than answers. "This isn't right," she muttered to herself, pushing the papers aside and stroking Roberta, who sat dutifully at her feet. The unease from the night before had grown into a gnawing anxiety. She made a mental note to call a trusted lawyer later that week for clarification. Before she could act, the sound of tires crunching against the gravel driveway drew her attention. Peeking out from the kitchen window, she saw William's car. Her heart sank. It was unusual for him to visit so soon after their last meeting. He stepped out of the vehicle, followed closely by Sarah, her face lit up with what seemed like forced enthusiasm. Norma opened the door reluctantly. "William, Sarah, twice in 1 week, to what do I owe the pleasure? We were just in the neighborhood," Sarah chirped, breezing past her into the living room as though it were her own. William followed, carrying a leather-bound portfolio. Norma's stomach tightened. There was something different about their demeanor today. They were more businesslike, less cordial. The air between them felt heavy, as if they were preparing for a confrontation. "Mom," William began after they had all taken seats. He glanced briefly at Sarah before continuing, "We need to talk about your future." "My future?" Norma asked, her tone sharp. Roberta, sensing her discomfort, hopped onto her lap and let out a low growl. Sarah leaned forward, adopting a patronizing smile. "Mom, we've been talking and we're worried about you. Living here all alone isn't safe. What if something happens to you and no one's around to help? We think it's time to explore other options." Norma's heart raced. "What kind of options?" William sighed, his loyally patience thinning. "A facility, a retirement community maybe, somewhere you'll be cared for 24/7. Norma's eyes narrowed. "You mean a nursing home?" Sarah gave a nervous laugh. "That's such a harsh way to put it. Think of it as a fresh start. You'll have people your age to socialize with, staff to take care of the housework, and we'll come visit all the time." Norma didn't respond immediately. Her mind raced, trying to process their words. Her children, the same ones she had sacrificed everything for, were discussing her life as though she were a burden. "I don't think I'm ready for that," she said finally, her voice steady but laced with an edge of defiance. William exchanged a glance with Sarah. "Mom, this isn't up for debate. We've already started the paperwork." Norma's jaw tightened. "Paperwork?" "Yes," Sarah said, her tone softening as though trying to placate her. "It's really just a formality. The papers you signed the other day, they're part of it." Norma felt the air leave her lungs. The documents. Her children had tricked her into signing away her rights. Anger and betrayal surged through her, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I need some time to think about this," she said, rising from her seat. Roberta barked sharply, as if echoing her unease. "Of course, Mom," Sarah said sweetly. But the flicker of frustration in her eyes didn't escape Norma's notice. As the siblings prepared to leave, William's phone buzzed. He stepped outside to take the call, while Sarah lingered in the living room, pretending to admire an old family portrait on the wall. Norma stood quietly in the hallway, out of sight, but close enough to hear Sarah mumbling into her own phone. Her heart pounded as she strained to catch the words. "She's not going to make this easy," Sarah whispered. "No, but William thinks we can push it through by the end of the month. Once she's declared legally incompetent, the court will back us up. Yes, I know, she has that stupid dog. We'll figure something out." Norma's blood ran cold. Declared incompetent? She pressed a hand against the wall to steady herself, her knees threatening to give way. Her own children were plotting to strip her of her independence, to rob her of her dignity. When William re-entered the house, Sarah quickly ended her call and flashed a bright smile. "Well, Mom, we should get going," she said, her voice unnervingly cheerful. Norma nodded numbly, her mind already racing. She barely heard their goodbyes as they walked out the door. Once the sound of their car had faded into the distance, she sank into her chair, trembling. Roberta climbed into her lap, nuzzling her comfortingly. "I won't let them do this to us," Norma whispered, stroking Roberta's fur. Her eyes hardened with resolve. For years, she had been the caregiver, the provider, the fighter. That part of her wasn't gone, it had just been dormant. Now it was awakening. She had sacrificed everything for her children, but if they thought they could betray her without consequence, they had underestimated the strength of a mother scorned. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window as Norma sat at the table. The documents her children had coerced her into signing spread out before her. Her hands trembled slightly, but her mind was sharp, her resolve firm. Roberta lay curled at her feet, sensing her owner's tension. She had always prided herself on her resilience, her ability to adapt and overcome. Losing her husband had tested her, but she had emerged stronger for her children's sake. Now, those same children were scheming to destroy everything she had built. The betrayal cut deep, but Norma knew she couldn't afford to wallow in self-pity. She needed a plan. Norma reached for her phone and dialed the number of Edward Marshall, her late husband's old friend and a trusted attorney. Edward had handled Jack's estate after his passing, and she knew he could be counted on for discretion. "Norma, it's been too long." Edward's warm, gravelly voice came through the line. "How can I help you?" "Edward," she began, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. "I need your help. It's urgent." Indeed, an hour later, Norma sat across from Edward in his downtown office. The walls were lined with shelves of legal books, and the faint scent of leather and ink filled the air. She slid the documents across his polished desk. "They made me sign these," she explained, her voice tinged with frustration. "I didn't understand what I was agreeing to at the time." Edward adjusted his glasses and scanned the papers, his expression growing darker with each page. "This is serious, Norma," he said finally, setting the documents down. "They've positioned themselves as co-guardians of your estate. If they follow through, they could argue in court that you're unfit to manage your own affairs. They'd have control over everything, your assets, your home." Norma's jaw tightened. "There has to be a way to stop them." Edward nodded. "There is, but it won't be easy. We can contest these documents, but that will take time. Meanwhile, you need to protect your assets. Do you have a will?" "Yes," she replied, "but it hasn't been updated in years." "Then we need to fix that immediately," Edward said, pulling out a blank legal pad. "We'll draft a new will, one that makes it clear your wishes are to be honored no matter what. And we'll include clauses to protect your dog and ensure your children are held accountable if they fail in their responsibilities." Norma nodded, her resolve hardening. "We want to make it clear, Edward. If my children continue down this path, I'd rather my fortune go to charity than to them." Edward raised an eyebrow but didn't question her. He began drafting the new will as Norma laid out her intentions. She wanted her wealth to go toward causes she cared about, scholarships for underprivileged students, shelters for abused animals, and food programs for struggling families. By the time they finished, Norma felt a flicker of hope. The new will was a shield, a weapon she could wield against her children's greed, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. Her children wouldn't give up easily. That evening, Norma invited William and Sarah to the house. When they arrived, their expressions were a mix of curiosity and suspicion. She greeted them warmly, her demeanor so calm it threw them off guard. "I've been thinking about what you said," Norma began, gesturing for them to sit in the living room. "About the future." William and Sarah exchanged a quick glance. Sarah leaned forward, her tone syrupy. "That's great, Mom. We just want what's best for you." Norma smiled faintly, her eyes sharp. I've taken some steps to make sure my wishes are respected. I've updated my will. The announcement hung in the air like a thunderclap. William's expression darkened. What do you mean, updated? I've decided that my estate will be handled differently, Norma said evenly. If either of you fail to care for me and Roberta as promised, everything will go to charity. Every penny. Sarah's face turned pale. Mom, that's... she began, but Norma raised a hand to silence her. I'm not finished, Norma said firmly. I also know about your plans to declare me incompetent. Don't bother denying it. I heard you. William's jaw clenched. Mom, you're misunderstanding. No, she interrupted, her voice like steel. You're the ones who misunderstood. You thought you could manipulate me, take everything I worked for and discard me like I don't matter. But I'm not the frail old woman you think I am. The siblings sat in stunned silence, their schemes unraveling before them. Norma leaned back in her chair, Roberta perched protectively on her lap. You have a choice, Norma continued. You can honor your roles as my children, care for me and stay in my life, or you can lose me and my legacy entirely. William stood abruptly, his face a mask of barely contained anger. You think you can threaten us? It's not a threat, Norma said calmly. It's a promise. With that, the siblings stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind them. Norma sat in the quiet aftermath, her heart pounding but her resolve intact. She didn't know what their next move would be, but she was prepared to fight for her dignity, her independence, and her beloved Roberta. As she sat there, stroking Roberta's fur, Norma felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in a long while, she was standing up for herself, and she wasn't going to back down. The days following Norma's confrontation with her children were tense and unnerving. The phone rang incessantly with calls from William and Sarah, alternating between attempts at sweet-talking her and outright threats. Norma ignored them all. She knew her children too well. They wouldn't let go of their plans so easily. Every day spent in her own home felt like waiting for an inevitable storm. She had to act. The decision crystallized one evening as she sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The house that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a cage. She stroked Roberta's soft fur, the dog looking up at her with trusting eyes. We're leaving, Norma said aloud, her voice firm. Roberta wagged her tail as if in agreement. Norma wasted no time. She reached out to Maria Johnson, an old friend from her church days. Maria was a no-nonsense woman who had always been fiercely loyal, and she lived in a small coastal town a few hours away. Norma explained her predicament in broad strokes, leaving out the ugliest details, and Maria didn't hesitate. Come stay with me, Maria said. No questions, no judgment. Just pack what you need and get here. Norma began her preparations immediately. She packed lightly, a few changes of clothes, some cherished photos, and essentials for Roberta. The house, with its carefully curated furnishings and mementos of a lifetime, felt suddenly less important. What mattered now was her freedom and her peace of mind. Under the cover of darkness, Norma loaded her car. Roberta hopped into the passenger seat, her ears perked as if sensing the significance of the moment. Norma took one last look at the house, its windows glowing faintly in the moonlight. She felt a pang of sadness, but also a surge of determination. Goodbye, she whispered, before driving away. The road stretched before her, winding through fields and forests as she left behind the life that had become a battleground. With each passing mile, Norma felt a weight lifting from her chest. By the time she reached Maria's home, a cozy cottage nestled near the shore, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. Maria greeted her with open arms, ushering her inside and making her feel at home. The sound of the ocean, just steps from the back porch, filled the air with a sense of calm Norma hadn't felt in years. She spent her first day there, walking along the beach with Roberta, the waves lapping at her feet as the salty breeze ruffled her hair. For the first time in decades, Norma felt truly alive. The worries of her children and their scheming faded with the sound of the surf. She realized how much she had sacrificed over the years, postponing her own dreams for the sake of others. Now, for the first time, she was living for herself. Maria, ever the practical hostess, helped Norma settle in and even suggested a plan to secure her anonymity. "We'll register your address here under my name," Maria said. "If they come looking for you, they won't find anything." Norma was grateful, but knew she couldn't impose on Maria forever. After a week of rest and reflection, she found a small rental property nearby. A modest cabin perched on a bluff overlooking the sea. It was perfect. Using funds she had quietly moved to a private account, Norma paid the first 6 months' rent in advance and began to make the place her own. The cabin became her sanctuary. Days were spent walking the beach with Roberta, reading novels she had never found the time for, and cooking meals that she enjoyed without the burden of catering to others. Nights were filled with the sound of waves crashing against the rocks, lulling her to sleep. For weeks, her children didn't contact her, likely stewing over their thwarted plans. But Norma no longer cared. She had shed the weight of their expectations and manipulations, reclaiming her life on her own terms. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink over the ocean, Norma sat on the cabin's porch, Roberta curled at her feet. She sipped a glass of wine, savoring the moment. The air was crisp, the horizon endless. For the first time in years, she felt completely at peace. "This is where I was meant to be," Norma whispered, smiling softly. Roberta wagged her tail in agreement. Norma knew her children might try to track her down eventually, but she also knew she was ready for whatever came next. She had found her freedom, and she wasn't going to give it up. Not for anyone. Months passed in quiet serenity. Norma had settled into her small cabin by the sea, carving out a life defined by simplicity and peace. Each morning began with the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks, a sound that had become her lullaby. Roberta, her ever-loyal companion, greeted her with a wagging tail, ready for their daily walks along the shore. Norma's days were unhurried. She tended a small garden, read novels by the fire, and cooked meals that filled the cabin with warmth and flavor. Occasionally Maria would visit, bringing fresh gossip from town or a basket of baked goods. They would sit on the porch, sipping tea and watching the sun melt into the horizon, their conversations filled with laughter and reflection. Despite the tranquility, Norma's mind often wandered to her children. She didn't regret her decision to leave. Far from it. But there was an ache that never fully dissipated. They were her flesh and blood, after all. She had hoped to spend her final years surrounded by their love, not running from their betrayal. Still, she had made her choice, and she stood by it. One crisp autumn morning, Norma received an envelope forwarded by Maria from her old address. The return address was a law firm she recognized as William's employer. She hesitated before opening it, her heart thudding heavily in her chest. Inside was a formal letter requesting her presence in court, a last-ditch effort by her children to contest her competence and reclaim control of her estate. Norma sighed deeply. She had expected this, but hoped they might have given up by now. Instead of panic, she felt a quiet resolve. She penned a letter to Edward, instructing him to proceed with the legal protections they had discussed. Her will, ironclad and explicit, would ensure her wishes were honored. She would not attend the hearing. Her life was no longer tethered to their schemes. As the weeks turned into months, the cabin became more than a sanctuary. It was her haven. Norma spent her time reflecting on the life she had lived, the sacrifices she had made, and the woman she had become. She realized that while her children's betrayal had hurt deeply, it had also freed her. For so long, she had defined herself through her roles as a wife, a mother, a provider. Now, for the first time, she was simply Norma. One evening, as the sky turned a deep indigo and the first stars began to twinkle, Norma felt a strange heaviness settle over her. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was unmistakable, a sense of finality. She sat on the porch with Roberta on her lap, gazing at the endless ocean. The waves shimmered under the moonlight, their ebb and flow steady and eternal. "I think my time is coming, Roberta," she murmured, stroking the dog's soft fur. "But don't you worry, you'll be taken care of." She had already made arrangements with Maria to care for Roberta when the time came. Maria, ever the steadfast friend, had promised to give the little terrier a loving home. That night, Norma went to bed with a heart full of gratitude. She drifted off to sleep, listening to the waves, a smile on her lips. Roberta nestled beside her. By morning, she was gone, her face serene, as if she had simply slipped into a dream. Maria found Norma the next day, her heart breaking as she realized her dear friend had passed. Roberta whimpered softly, curling up beside Norma one last time. Maria honored Norma's wishes, taking Roberta home and notifying Edward to handle the legal affairs. When William and Sarah were informed of their mother's passing, they rushed to the coastal town, not out of grief, but with the hope of salvaging their inheritance. Their expectations were shattered when Edward revealed the terms of Norma's will. Her fortune had been divided among charities, scholarships, animal shelters, food programs, leaving nothing for her children. "She warned you," Edward said bluntly, handing them a sealed letter from Norma. The siblings opened the letter with trembling hands. Norma's handwriting was neat and deliberate, each word striking like a dagger. "To William and Sarah, you were my greatest joy and my deepest sorrow. I loved you unconditionally, even when you failed to love me in return. But love without respect is hollow, and I could not allow your greed to destroy the life I built. You made your choices, and so did I. I hope one day you will understand that true wealth is not found in money or possessions, but in the love and kindness we give to others. It is not too late to change. Goodbye, my children. I pray you find peace. Mom." The letter left them speechless, their guilt and regret crashing over them like waves against the rocks. They had lost their mother, not just her inheritance, but the chance to reconcile, to make amends. It was a loss far greater than they had anticipated. Back at the cabin, Norma's presence lingered in the quiet spaces, the porch where she watched the sunsets, the beach where she walked with Roberta, the garden she had tended with care. Her legacy was not in the money her children had sought to steal, but in the lives she touched and the peace she found in her final days. The ocean continued its eternal song, a reminder that life, like the waves, ebbs and flows. And for Norma, her final chapter had ended, not in betrayal, but in freedom. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.